If someone tells me that I've hurt their feelings, I say, well, I'm still waiting to hear what your point is.
Augustine was a self-centered fantasist and an earth-centered ignoramus. He was guiltily convinced that God cared about his trivial theft from some unimportant pear trees, and quite persuaded, by an analogous solipsism, that the sun revolved around the earth. He also fabricated the mad and cruel idea that the souls of unbaptized children were sent to limbo. Who can guess the load of misery that this diseased theory has placed on millions of Catholic parents down the years, until its shamefaced and only partial revision by the Church in our own time? Luther was terrified of demons and believed that the mentally afflicted were the devil's work. Muhammad is claimed by his own followers to have thought, as did Jesus, that the desert was pullulating with jinns or evil spirits. One must state it plainly. Religion comes from the period of human prehistory when nobody, not even the mighty Democritus, who concluded that all matter was made from atoms, had the smallest idea what was going on. It comes from the bawling and fearful infancy of our species and is a babyish attempt to meet our inescapable demand for knowledge, as well as for comfort, reassurance, and other infantile needs.
It may not be said that there is no God. It may be said that there is no reason to think that there is one. That was the situation after Lucretius and Democritus and the original anti-theistic thinkers began their critique of religion. That evolution occurred is conclusively verified by the record of molecular biology and of fossil record. There has never been an article in any peer-reviewed journal, and there never will be, to say to the contrary. However, that's only to say that it did occur. How it occurred is not something that's completely consensual, and the Darwinian theory of natural selection is only so far the least contested of those explanations. And Stephen Jay Gould, for example, of whom I was something of a friend and a great admirer, and Richard Dawkins, who's also a friend of mine, had a tremendous disagreement, still do, posthumous in the case of now, about punctuated evolution, about the steps by which this occurred. But that it occurred is not to be doubted. Because religion is not provided to us by revelation. It doesn't come from the heavens. It doesn't come from the beyond. It doesn't come from the divine. It's man-made. And it shows. It shows very well that religion is created, invented, imposed by a species half a chromosome away from the chimpanzee. It shows, doesn't it? Is there anywhere of the places I've mentioned, and I exempt Basra and all the other bees I could take you around, where it wouldn't be enormously welcome if there was a mass conversion to secularism or a mass adoption of the secular idea and principle? Now, for there to be a fair test about this, you'd have to do the following. And no one I've ever debated with has even tried it. So you be the first. You find me a state or a society that threw off theocracy and threw off religion and said we adopt the teachings of Lucretius and Democritus and Galileo and Spinoza and Darwin and Russell and Jefferson and Thomas Paine. And we make those what we teach our children. We make that scientific and rational humanism our teaching. And you find me that state that did that and fell into tyranny and slavery and famine and torture, and then we'll be on a level playing field. As it is, all you've done is show that the idea of worship and the idea of credulity and the idea of servility and slavery to religion is a bad idea in the first place. Every modern state has had to go through a period of declericalization of one kind of violence or another. The Cromwellian Revolution, the Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, the wars in Spain, the wars in Italy, the French Revolution, which you mentioned, they all have to go through it. It's usually in proportion to how vile, how filthy, how cruel, how tyrannical, how greedy, how ghastly was the pre-existing clerical regime on which much of this must be blamed. But you can't say that the test of humanistic, secular, atheist values has been conducted until you've had that conducted fairly.
But are not the holy books of official monotheism absolutely dripping with material yearning and with admiring almost mouth-watering descriptions of Solomon's wealth, the thriving flocks and herds of the faithful, the rewards for a good Muslim in paradise, to say nothing of many, many lurid tales of plunder and spoils. Jesus, it is true, shows no personal interest in gain, but he does speak of treasure in heaven and even of mansions as an inducement to follow him. Is it not further true that all religions down the ages have shown a keen interest in the amassment of material goods in the real world? It is not snobbish to notice the way in which people show their gullibility and their herd instinct and their wish, or perhaps their need, to be credulous and to be fooled. This is an ancient problem. Credulity may be a form of innocence and even innocuous in itself, but it provides a standing invitation for the wicked and the clever to exploit their brothers and sisters, and is thus one of humanity's great vulnerabilities. No honest account of the growth and persistence of religion, or the reception of miracles and revelations, is possible without reference to this stubborn fact.
Now, relativism, I thought we were agreed. But Anne Widdecombe says slavery has to be considered in context. What's more relative than that? There were people at the time, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, there were innumerable humanists and secularists who said slavery is evil. The church wouldn't agree. Now, which is it then? Is it that the church is wrong, or, even more suggestive, that God has not yet revealed that it's wrong to them? Or did God support it all those years and then change his mind? From a beginning point of absurdity, you arrive at a terminal point of absolute moral chaos.
Whereas to tell a child, you go to this church, which means you'll go to heaven, but your little playmates don't go to that church, and therefore will go to hell, seems to me to be an unpleasant thing to be saying. But
yes, that is.
Maybe I'm in a minority then.
That could be an unpleasant thing, but how do you...
Actually, an evil thing.
Let's call it evil, Christopher.
And something that only a religious person would dream of saying.
Let's call it evil. Where does evil come from?
Religion. Everyone has to understand that it is those who feel that the divine is prompting them, who feel they're permitted anything and everything. And it is those who are the leading, most salient, most violent, most vicious opponents of the values and civilization that Thomas Jefferson stood for and promulgated. I'm making the assumption that all of you check in every now and then with some kind of news outlet and have a view of what's going on in the rest of the world. Isn't it as plain as could be that those who commit the most callous, the most cruel, the most brutal, the most indiscriminate atrocities of all do so precisely because they believe they have divine permission? There is no explanation for the origins of our species, for the origins of our cosmos, for the origins of our globe itself. There is not one explanation left which requires the existence of a deus ex machina.
If you can exclude it, if you can limit it, you can limit it to a private belief, a belief people keep in their homes and so forth, which are, of course, are more than entitled to do. It means you don't find that you're dealing with a class of witch doctors, mullahs, priests, rabbis and others who make a living in politics by saying that they have special rights because they're doing God's will, which has been a curse to humanity throughout its entire existence. And currently, I think, in the form of theocracy and its various bullying threats, represents a very direct, immediate threat to the survival of our species.
There is no big brother in the sky. It is a horrible idea that there is somebody who owns us, who mates us, who supervises us, waking and sleeping, who knows our thoughts, who can convict us of thought crime, just for what we think, who can judge us while we sleep for things that might occur to us in our dreams, who can create us sick, as apparently we are, and then order us on pain of eternal torture to be well again. To demand this, to wish this to be true, is to wish to live as an abject slave. It is a wonderful thing. It is a wonderful thing, in my submission, that we now have enough information, enough intelligence, and I hope enough intellectual and moral courage to say that this ghastly proposition is founded on a lie, and to celebrate that fact. And I invite you to join me in doing so. Thank you.
It can even be argued that Buddhism is not, in our sense of the word, a religion at all. Nonetheless, the Perfect One is alleged to have left one of his teeth behind in Sri Lanka, and I once attended a ceremony which involved a rare public showing by priests of this gold-encased object. Bishop Heber did not mention bone in his stupid hymn, though it would have made just as good a rhyme as stone, and perhaps this was because Christians have always foregathered to bow down to bones of supposed saints, and to keep them in grisly reliquaries in their churches and cathedrals. However that may be, at the tooth propitiation I had no feeling at all of peace and inner bliss. The human species is an animal species without very much variation within it, and it's idle and futile to imagine that a voyage to Tibet, say, will discover an entirely different harmony with nature or eternity. The Dalai Lama, for example, is entirely and easily recognizable to a secularist. In exactly the same way as a medieval princeling, he makes the claim not just that Tibet should be independent of Chinese hegemony, a perfectly good demand, if I may render it into everyday English, but that he himself is a hereditary king appointed by heaven itself. How convenient! Dissenting sects within his faith are persecuted. His one-man rule in an Indian enclave is absolute. He makes absurd pronouncements about sex and diet, and when on his trips to Hollywood fundraisers, anoints major donors like Steven Seagal and Richard Gere as holy. Indeed, even Mr. Gere was moved to whine a bit when Mr. Seagal was invested as a tulku, or person of high enlightenment. It must be annoying to be outbid at such a spiritual auction. Before Charles Darwin revolutionized our entire concept of our origins, and Albert Einstein did the same for the beginnings of our cosmos, many scientists and philosophers and mathematicians took what might be called the default position and professed one or other version of deism, which held that the order and predictability of the universe seemed indeed to imply a designer, if not necessarily a designer, who took any active part in human affairs. This compromise was a logical and rational one for its time, and was especially influential among the Philadelphia and Virginia intellectuals, such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who managed to seize a moment of crisis and use it to enshrine Enlightenment values in the founding documents of the United States of America.
The attention paid to ex-cathedra remarks made by the man I think of as the Bishop of Rome, which is what he's called in the 39 Articles of the Church of England, but is invariably referred to in our media as if not only he was the Pope, but as if this country was a Catholic country. The attention given to him, the deference given to a man whose title to be the Vicar of Christ on earth is surely, as well as untestable, extremely immodest and lacking in humility. The Coptic Christians of Egypt have a pope. The Byzantine Orthodox Christians of the East have a number of popes. There was, in living memory, a rival pope to this pope in Avignon and elsewhere. It seems very odd to me all the time that this man is always called the Pope as if there was only one and as if we owed him attention. That's just an obvious example.
Do not bow the knee to a celestial dictatorship, unalterable, unchangeable, unappealable to. If you don't believe in that, you would have no means of telling right from wrong. How would you know how to do the right thing or avoid the wrong if you were not being told by a celestial dictatorship? Once again, an absolutely central attack on any concept that we might have of our own integrity, dignity, and self-respect. How would Huck Finn know? Admittedly, he's a fictional character, but then so are most of the people I'm going to be discussing, from Moses onwards. How does Huck Finn know that he's not to betray his friend Jim? He's not to give him back. He's not to give him up to the people who are hunting for him. How does Mark Twain know that we will like Huck when he refuses this? What does Huck know? The law is against him. The church is against him. All the preachments of religion and customary law are against him. He thinks that if he refuses the demand to give up his slave friend, he's going to go straight to hell. That's what he thinks, but he still does the right thing, as we might all hope to do, as we must all hope to do, if we were tested much less than that. It's innate in us. Religion gets its morals from us. We know what the right thing is without being told by a celestial dictatorship.
There were dozens of part-educated, unscrupulous, ambitious, fanatical men like Smith in the Palmyra, New York area at that epoch, but only one of them achieved takeoff. This is for two probable reasons. First, and by all accounts, including those of his enemies, Smith had great natural charm and authority and fluency, what Max Weber called the charismatic part of leadership. Second, there were at that time a great number of people hungry for soil and a new start in the West. constituting a huge latent force behind the notion of a new leader, let alone a new holy book, that could augur a promised land. The wanderings of the Mormons in Missouri and Illinois and Utah, and the massacres that they both suffered and inflicted on the way, gave body and sinew to the idea of martyrdom and exile, and to the idea of the Gentiles, as they scornfully called the unbelievers. It is a great historical story, and, unlike its origin in a piece of vulgar fabrication, can be read with respect. It does, however, have two indelible stains. The first is the sheer obviousness and crudity of its revelations, which were opportunistically improvised by Smith and later by his successors as they went along. And the second is its revoltingly crude racism. Christian preachers of all kinds had justified slavery until the American Civil War and even afterwards on the supposed biblical warrant that of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Ham had been cursed and cast into servitude. But Joseph Smith took this nasty fable even further, fulminating in his Book of Abraham that the swarthy races of Egypt had inherited this very curse. Also, at the made-up Battle of Cumorah, a site located conveniently near his own birthplace, the Nephites, described as fair-skinned and handsome, contended against the Lamanites, whose descendants were punished with dark pigment for turning away from God. As the crisis over American slavery mounted, Smith and his even more dubious disciples preached against the abolitionists in antebellum Missouri. They solemnly said that there had been a third group in heaven during the ultimate battle between God and Lucifer. This group, as it was explained, had tried to remain neutral, but after Lucifer's defeat they had been forced into the world, compelled to take bodies in the accursed lineage of Canaan, and hence the Negro or African race. If anything proves the human manufacture of religion, it is the way that the Mormon elders resolve this difficulty. Confronted by the plain words of one of their holy books, and the increasing contempt and isolation that it imposed upon them, they did as they had done when their fondness for polygamy would have brought federal retribution upon God's own Utah. They had still another revelation, and more or less in time for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, had it divinely disclosed to them that black people were human after all.
Hitler's birthday was celebrated from the pulpit by order of the Vatican, by every church in Germany, till the last day of his regime. Do I say that makes you a National Socialist? No, I don't. No, I don't. I would know how to if I was capable of a low blow. But as you know, I'm not.
The Old Testament says, or does not say, that Abraham was doing a noble thing by offering to sacrifice a son to prove himself loyal to God or to the voices he was hearing in his head. It says there was a noble thing for him to do. He was rewarded for it by a great posterity and a great long life. Offering to murder his son because of hearing voices in his head. This is not moral teaching to me. Is it not the case that the Old Testament says that the Amalekites must all be destroyed down to the last child, every one among them, leave not one? Yes, it does say that. The Bishop of Llandaff, in an argument with Thomas Paine, once said, well, when it says keep the women, as Paine had pointed out, he said, I'm sure God didn't mean just to keep them for immoral purposes. Well, what does the Bishop of Llandaff know about that? It says kill all the men, kill all the children, and keep the virgins. I think I know what they had in mind. I don't think it's moral teaching. It doesn't make people happy. They can't be happy till I believe it too. My children must be taught this stuff. No, sir, no, ma'am, no day, no way, no shape, no form. You keep your illusion private. And I hope it does make you happy, and there's perhaps some reason why it would. But we're told the Pope's authority to say you can't have a condom comes from his ability to certify a miracle, a disturbance in the natural order. I think it was David Hume who put it slightly vulgarly. This was again about the virgin birth, I think. Which is more likely, that the whole natural order is suspended, or that a Jewish minx should tell a lie? Whereas, is it not written that I come not to bring a peace but a sword? Surely it is. Is it not written that those who won't follow me must depart and be cast into everlasting fire? Not a very gentle or pacific remark. Is it not said that if you don't give up your family, if you don't give up thrift, if you don't give up everyone who loves you and everything you love to sacrifice yourself for me, you're not worthy? These are strongly coercive and implicitly authoritarian or even totalitarian statements. And as C.S. Lewis rightly says, it's one of the very rare occasions where I agree with him, he said, you may not say that the preachments of Jesus of Nazareth are all right, even if you don't accept the religious basis of them. Lewis quite correctly says, if you don't accept that this man was the Son of God, you'll have to notice that many of his statements and sermons are either wicked or insane, or both. It's only on the belief that the world is very soon coming to an end, and that he himself has the right to claim a messianic role in this conclusion, that any of it can make any sort of sense at all. And everyone here knows at least some of the examples of what would be counted as wicked or insane if the messianic claims were found to be questionable, which they have been.
Say there's no intervention, we go to heat death. Does that mean that the universe was not created and not designed?
It doesn't entail that belief, no, but it makes it...
Okay, so what's your point?
It makes it seem a very capricious designer. Shall we say, rather as I said, it's an old verse of Phil Greville's, created sick, commanded to be well. Why would people be told, okay, I can create you, but I'm going to create you with original sin, misery, shame, death of children, disease, and so on, just to see if you can pass a test that would mean I might not send you to hell? I don't say that that didn't happen. I say that I'm very glad that the evidence for it is very scanty. And I accuse those who do believe it, and I can't have been surely misunderstood on this point, of harboring a very sinister desire to live in a totalitarian system.
How do you define sinister?
Mr. Hitchens.
The desire to be a slave.
Is that
masochism?
I regard
masochism.
In your brain,
I regard
or is there
masochism.
Something beyond you that...
I'll say that I think masochism is a sinister and creepy impulse. Yes. And one of the great opponents of the Islamic totalitarianism in ancient Persia was the great Omar Khayyam, perhaps the greatest poet of old Persia, whose Rubaiyat, I'm sure, is known at least to some of you. And my favorite verse of this comes from the Robert Le Gallienne translation, and it takes the form of a question. The quatrain is in the form of a question. It says, "And do you think that unto such as you, a maggot-minded, starved, fanatic crew, God gave a secret and denied it me? Well, well, what matters it? Believe that too." To this magnificent astronomer and scientist and physician and humanist of Persia, who opposed the cruel, sadistic, verminous, ignorant mullahs of his day, I borrow the question, what is your authority for saying that you know something that I don't?
Our belief is not a belief. Our principles are not a faith. We do not rely solely upon science and reason, because these are necessary rather than sufficient factors, but we distrust anything that contradicts science or outrages reason. We may differ on many things, but what we respect is free inquiry, open-mindedness, and the pursuit of ideas for their own sake. We do not hold our convictions dogmatically. The disagreement between Professor Stephen Jay Gould and Professor Richard Dawkins concerning punctuated evolution and the unfilled gaps in post-Darwinian theory is quite wide, as well as quite deep. But we shall resolve it by evidence and reasoning, and not by mutual excommunication.
I am obsessed with sex. Ever since I discovered that my God-given male member was going to give me no peace, I decided to give it no rest in return. Seems fair to me.